Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to Midrash U. Let's see if we can get the right screens up there. All right, so I am by myself in the sound booth and in front of the camera, so you're not going to see me today, but you'll hear the voice from behind the curtain. We are not in Kansas anymore. All right, well, today is February 18th, 2023. It is the 27th of Shabbat for the year 5783, as according to the accounting by the rabbinics, which sometimes is spot on, sometimes is not so much. That's another story. We are talking about the early church fathers, and the reason that we are talking about these things is that there is a move today to look at the apostolic fathers or the early church fathers and to say, well, they were closest to Jesus, so they had it right, and then after that it all devolves and gets ugly, which may be true, may not be true. Those are some of the issues that we are trying to wrap our heads around. We are trying to take an approach on this that doesn't try to say, well, we over here in our little box have it right and the rest of you are off in left field. We will look at differences in how people understand things, understanding that ultimately there is but one way that things are true. They can't be simultaneously true in different ways. Okay, and so we don't make the claim to have to have cornered the market on trueness of God. When Christ comes back, I have every expectation as well as assurance given to us by the Apostle Paul that we will all be in unity, that we will all perfectly know God as Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah tells us, and others. Right, and that no matter what, we will be echad, we will be one with God. The only way we can be one with God is if we understand things not how we understand them, but how God understands them. Right, and that's the whole goal in this. And so part of these conversations is to cut everybody a lot of slack who disagrees, with the expectation that they disagree not because they want to be a contrarian, not because they want to be goofy, but because they actually feel that they see things differently than others do, okay? And the reality is that somebody's going to be right, somebody's going to be wrong, or maybe everybody's wrong and God is right. I'm sure there will be places where that ends up being true as well. But the reality is that we want to understand the differences, and partly so that we can understand that God is one, God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and our attempts as well as everybody else's attempts to understand that become really the primary issue. As always, we are seeking to understand God's revelation to the world given through the Tanakh and the Old Testament and the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, that we see this as one God, one plan, one calling to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, that we would be equipped to walk in the works that God prepared for us before God laid the foundations of the earth. Okay, I am Messianic teacher Elder Rusty Simpson. This is Arrowhead Messianic Congregation, and you can reach me at midrashu.cms@gmail.com. All right. I've not had anybody email me regarding materials, but I'll be glad to supply course materials and links, particularly the places that I am researching things, and that way we can all kind of be on the same page, and you can do your own research on these things too. Don't take my word about it. It is a long conversation, and that conversation is best had in conjunction with different opinions as well. All right. So as a real quick synopsis, remember that all of this depends on Yeshua HaMashiach. He makes very specific claims about being the Son of God, being God, being echad with God the Father, being one with God the Father. We understand this from the Gospel of John, that there is absolutely positively no light that passes between them, that there is no difference between them. Unlike the Marcionian view, which says there is this demigod of the Old Testament who's mean and nasty and is standing up in place of the real God who created everything, and then replaces that old demigod who's mean and nasty as the God of love. God is one. The God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament, and he so loved us that he made a way possible for us to be reconciled unto him where there is no way possible for us to reconcile ourselves. Okay, that part of the good news is crucially important. If it's possible for us to save ourselves, then there will be as many ways unto God as there are people, because my way may be different than your way, which may be different than their way. Okay. Scripture is very clear that there are none that are righteous, no, not one. There are none that seek after God, no, not one. Right? And these end up being contentious words when you divide them up between the Calvinist and the Arminianist Protestant Reform positions. And I would just tell you that both of them have it a little right and both of them have it a lot wrong, right? Because they're trying to combine things that should be separated. From the standpoint of there's a unilateral promise of God, doesn't depend upon us, that it's the death and the resurrection of Christ. And what we see, and in those are represented as the Passover lamb and the crossing of the Red Sea. After we cross the Red Sea, it's now if-then statements. It's all bilateral. If you will, I will. Right? This is where the Arminianists take that and expand it across everything. And where the Arminianists accuse the Calvinists, there are some hyper-Calvinists for whom this is true, then that they take the unilateral promises and expand it across everything. Both of those positions are wrong. There's unilateral and there's bilateral. And then, by the way, there's going to be unilateral again. Oddly enough, nobody questions that when Christ comes back, it does not depend upon us to have earned our glorification. We get it, we get different rewards according to how well we have been functional in the kingdom, but our glorification does not depend upon us. It's a unilateral promise of God, and it's a unilateral promise of God that goes all the way back to the Passover lamb and the crossing of the Red Sea, all the way back to the seven I will statements that God makes in Exodus chapter 6. So that's kind of the beginning point. Recognize that Yeshua comes, and he came, we're told specifically in Matthew, not to do away with the law and the prophets. You can't get more specific than what he says in Matthew chapter 5. Didn't come to do away with the law and the prophets. I didn't come to do away with them, but I came to make them replete, to blow them up like a balloon so that you fully understand them. Right, he then starts into these numerous sorts of discussions of, you have heard it said of old, you shall not murder. But I tell you, that was the unblown up balloon. He blows it up for you and says, if you've been angry with your brother or sister, you've already murdered them in your heart, you're already done. Okay? So he is making the law replete, making it understandable in a way so that they can see exactly what it is that God truly does require of them, okay? And as long as we're talking about what God requires of him, it's not obeying the law, okay? Really, really clear. This is the error of the Jews, that they felt that they could obey the law and make themselves righteous enough to stand before God. What he says over and over again is, if in Shema you will Shema unto the voice of Adonai, your God, okay? Hear his voice, listen intently with understanding, and then to give a considered response as to whether you will do or not do. There is no biblical word for obey. It's Shema. And not only is it Shema, but it's Shema and Shamar. Shamar is to zealously keep and protect that which God has said to do. And you see these two words, sometimes Shamar, Shema, sometimes Shema, Shamar, but they're flipped back and forth, but they're almost always found in close approximation when God is speaking and putting a requirement onto the children of Abraham by faith. And notice I didn't say the Jews or the Israelites. Okay, we are all grafted in, but it's children of Abraham by faith that are the children of promise. Okay, that doesn't mean, as my sister has brought up, and as has been true across these centuries, that we have replaced somebody. We have been added, we have been grafted in. When you graft something in, you're not replacing it, you're adding to it. Okay? Really, really clear. If you have a replacement theology, if you think that you have replaced the Jews, if you think you have replaced the Orthodox, if you think you've replaced the Catholics, if you think you've replaced the Lutherans, whoever you think you're replacing, Mormons, you have it wrong. Okay? Plain and simple. Yes, sir. You have a question or a comment? All right, why don't you grab the mic real quick, and hopefully they didn't leave this on all night, like last week. There we go.
Help us out here.
All right.
Rusty, what I'm understanding what you're saying, okay, can be said in just a few words. If this is not correct.
Okay.
What you're saying is clarity over agreement.
Agreement with God over agreement with man. How's that? A little different.
Yes,
but
that's the bottom line. But
yeah.
Essentially, in legal terms.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
The question
Clarity
is
over agreement. I think that's very important because you're looking at a lot of history there.
Yep.
And then a reality of understanding.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And let's be really clear. We're looking at a lot of history here where there are people across these faiths that do miraculous and wonderful things. Okay. Well, that puts a light into it that makes it a lot harder to argue with. I think it bolsters my position that they have it a little right but a little wrong, and that the grace of God, which is given to all of us, that we don't have perfect understanding now, but that we could. Our problem is, and I would say that the issue in all of these cases is one of power, one of people just wanting to get ahead of God and think it out for themselves, and then their own thoughts become more important than what the Bible says. Charles Finney is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and to continue with that, into, like you're saying, through the scriptures, okay, that remains the same as the gospel unfolds. We're going to have some little clarity there.
Yep.
And agreement is beyond. You know what I mean? So it just continues on.
Right.
So that's it.
Because when man gets involved in this, we're going to twist and contort the gospel in order to, you can set it down there, in order to come up with a consensus position. This is always what we want to do, but the reality is it doesn't have to agree with man, it has to agree with what God says. And Paul says, whether I, myself, or an angel come to you and give you a different gospel than the one that has been given to you, let them be anathema. Let them be viewed as a heretic. Okay, that's tough.
Be in the Holy Spirit.
Yep. And again, I would just say whether let's just constrain it to the Protestant argument of Calvinism versus Arminianism. You have people on both sides of that question who I think can very reasonably be held up as great men of God who did great works for the kingdom, but they didn't agree, right? And they didn't agree on the gospel. Let's be really clear about that. There's two different gospels when you have the Arminianist view and the Calvinist view. Can't get away from that. In one of those, it's God's work and God's work alone, and the other one, it's man's work. God is, as the Arminianists say, would hang in the ethereum completely impotent, right, until man chooses them. And at that point, then there's power that comes. But the ultimate power doesn't lie with God, it lies with man. And they say that it lies with man because man has been given free choice. And I would just say that they have misunderstood the scriptures, right? But from that gospel, we have the gospel that is pervasive in America today and in much of Christianity, where we convince people to make their own election to salvation. And that's what we do. The good news is if there is any in that, is that whether you have it right or whether you have it wrong, if it truly is, as the Bible says, that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, right? It doesn't say that your understanding of the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. It says the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. And that means that God is able to reach in and to flip somebody's reality in the hearing of the gospel, even if you preach it wrong. Now, if it's true that it is the gospel message of you have to make yourself election, then you can screw that message up. That's the other side of that becomes really troublesome if you truly think about it, right? Is, well, what if I didn't get the message right? If it depends upon me to get them to make their own election, and I gave them a poor rendition of it, or one that didn't work for them, again, in that vein, you get as many gospels as there are people in the world, right? Because each one is going to be reached in a slightly different way. Then it's not their fault that they didn't get the gospel, it's mine. Okay, but again, I would just say that what I see in Scripture resolves that question of Arminianism versus Calvinism in a very clear way. But recognize that these two groups both look at each other as heretics. The Arminianists have been declared heretics since the 1600s, right? That whole line of thought has been declared heresy, even though it is prevalent, since the 1600s. And by the way, the Arminianists are getting really close to having enough power within the church to return the favor, and they will. I mean, that's the way it goes, right? That's what we're seeing in the early church fathers, is that each of these groups say, well, I don't have it wrong, you've got it wrong. I'm not the heretic, you're the heretic. Who you calling heretic? I mean, it literally gets down to a pie throwing match, oftentimes, although not specifically. So we recognize that Yeshua HaMashiach is God. He is the concept of the living Torah. He is Echad with God. He makes that claim definitively in the Gospel of John. And he also tells us that we will be one with him if we keep his commandments. Okay, his commandments are not different than the commandments of God the Father. They are the commandments of God the Father, because if they're different, then we have two different gods. All right, and this is where it just starts getting really uncomfortable for people. And my encouragement to everybody is to recognize that it was never about keeping the letter of the law in order to attain anything. It's keeping the law dynamically, moment by moment, understanding that these laws are going to be in conflict with each other. If it's the Sabbath and somebody needs a hand, do you work to help them? Yes, you do, because ultimately God cares more about the individual than he cares about keeping arbitrary commandments. So we are to live, as the New and Old Testament tell us, dynamically walking in the law and living those things out, recognizing that moment by moment, one will be elevated above another. Okay, and we will have to make the appropriate understanding as the Old Testament, as God would do it. Understand them as he would understand them, and make the judgments that he would judge to do. That's what we're actually called to do. Shema, Shema, to the voice of Adonai your God, to zealously keep and protect his Brit and his commandments, and to view things with his eyes and do the judgments according to how he would do it. That is specifically what God has called you to do. Okay? And then he gives you the 10 commandments, which is not just the 10, but the broader extent of them that we are supposed to be, again, dynamically walking in and living in. And remember that if you mess it up, because we all do, grace abounds. All right? And it's not that we want to invoke the grace, right, to say, well, I don't need to worry about that because I got grace. All right? Absolutely, positively not. All right? But where we falter, and we will until the second coming of Christ, we know that he who has begun a good work in us will bring it to completion. Okay, you know, I've said many times that if-then statement side of things has a requirement for us to be doing stuff, but if you look carefully at the Old and the New Testament, it's still predominantly a work of God. He's still going to see to the details. When we mess it up, we just get up and pick up and start moving forward again. Okay? It is a work of God. When we were saved, the truth of Christ, when we are being saved, which is the way of Christ, and it is we will be saved in the glorification, the plurality of life that we have promised to us that will come. The way, the truth, and the life. These are all titles for living Torah. These are all titles of Christ. Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He was telling them, I'm living Torah, I'm living Torah, I'm living Torah. Oh, and by the way, we too will be living Torah because we will be made with him. Okay? But it's a dynamic process. So Yeshua comes, he willingly goes to the cross. Nobody takes his life from him. He willingly lays it down. He says specifically that nobody takes his life from him. He has the power to lay it down. He has the power to pick it back up again. And it is on Christ and Christ alone he has come and paid that debt. I had a conversation with a client who has a very, I would call him, he doesn't believe that there's any one religion that's right. And he doesn't believe that he thinks that they're all the same. And I tried to talk with him a little bit about that to show him that, in fact, if there are contradictions, they can't be the same God. So there's a couple of easy places that you can do that. I had those conversations with him. He immediately wanted to switch to other biblical or peri-biblical conversations. But one of the issues that he had is with who Christ is, and whether or not he truly is God or not, and whether or not God would come to earth. And so those conversations that we have with people, right, are important. Doesn't mean that they're going to come to fruition at that time, but we plant seeds. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation. And one of his points of contention was that it was ludicrous that Christ could come and die for man's sin. And he said if we had just not killed him, he was a great teacher and he would have gone on to teach us how to do things. And I told him he was absolutely positively wrong in that. I said he had to come and die. Nobody took his life from him. The only way that we have salvation is through Christ laying down his life, his willingness to hear what God the Father asked him to do and then to do it, because there was no other way. And this has come up before, somebody said, well, if we just gotten to Jesus Iscariot and convinced him of his wrong-headedness, right? He was placed there specifically in order to make sure that what had to happen was going to happen, right? It wasn't that if we had just gotten to him, and Christ never had to die, there wouldn't be one of us who were saved. That's the reality of it, right? Because none of us can by our own actions bridge that gap between ourselves and God. It's only through the salvation of Christ that's possible. And this goes right back to that conversation of, can you save yourself? Do you elect yourself to be saved, right? The nuts and bolts of it are that if that's true, then Christ really didn't need to die. That was Charles Finney's position. Charles Finney said that Christ, neither did he die for anybody, nor could he. That it was complete non sequitur. Pelagius also held that position in the time of the late 200s, 300s with St. Augustine and his conversations between them. That's why Charles Finney is called the American Pelagiast, because he held those identical views that really the only thing Christ was a good man with a good roadmap on how to save yourself. And that's all that he could do. And now I'm going to give you the roadmap too. So that was Charles Finney's gospel. So we have Christ who lays down his life, who saves not just the elect but all mankind, right? And we're going to have to put that in quotes because there are going to be people who do not end up with life everlasting, right? They go off to the pit of fire. And his disciples were the ones that were that were following him and struggling to wrap their heads around what it meant, even when they were with him. Okay, so I was asked before to kind of put a timeline together, and I pulled this from the internet, somebody else's slide, but it's a reasonable one. The dates, as you notice, some dates are estimated. It doesn't tell you which ones are estimated. I'll just tell you that the birth dates for most of the apostles are just not known. We have an idea that they're sometime in the 1st century. We know thereabouts when they died. Sometimes we know specifically when they died. Sometimes we don't. But we don't know exactly when it is that they were born. Same thing with Jesus, right? Notice that his death date is listed as 30 AD in this slide. Okay? Anybody know what year it was that Christ was crucified? 33 AD is the year that most people banter around because it's been used quite a bit in other theologies to make timelines as to things, although I would say that a couple years here or there probably isn't going to make a huge bit of difference. In 33 AD, the Passover was celebrated on a Friday. Christ tells us specifically that no sign does he give that generation but the sign of Jonah. Just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 nights and 3 days, so shall the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. Okay, so Friday night, he goes into the ground on Friday afternoon. Let's just spot him a day for the minute time frame. Remember, when does night fall on that time frame? 6, 7. So we're close to I'm sorry, not the solstice, to the equinox, which means the night and the day are equal time frames. However, when did light go from the world on that date? It was about, yeah. It was when Christ was being crucified that the light disappears, and everybody's like, what is going on here? Okay, so when the first 3 stars comes out is the beginning of the Hebrew night. Okay, so they don't keep an accounting according to the clock. They keep an accounting according to when the first 3 stars comes out.
So do we read that forward or backwards?
For-
Is it 67 come before 4 BC or is 4 BC correct?
We don't know exactly when he was born. 4 BC is probably right. We think that the striking down of the children of Bethlehem occurs in about 2 BC, and that in all likelihood that Christ was not a newborn in the manger at that time frame, but was about 2 years of age, and this is why was probably about a year of age, and why Herod said, anything 2 years and older, kill it. Yep. So 4 BC is not an unreasonable time frame, but we don't know exactly when. So 33 AD, it's a Friday Passover, right? When there's no way that you can get to Sunday and have truly 3 days and 3 nights, right? You might say, okay, well, if there was a sliver of the day on Friday, we're going to count any part of that day as a whole day. That would be Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday, right? If you take a noon accounting of things, and even if you say, well, it was after the sun came up that he was resurrected, but what the Gospels tell us is that Mary Magdalene and others go to the tomb after the Shabbat is over, and in the fading light of the day, right? They are seeking to work on Christ's body, because the more time that goes by, the more decay there's going to be, and so there's a timeliness to try to get this before it becomes a soup, right, and becomes nasty and all kinds of problems. So in the English, that didn't get purveyed very well, but in the Greek, it's actually there. And so that would be Saturday evening at the close of Shabbat. is when they went to the temple, or went to the tomb in order to get things, right? So, or could have been Sunday morning, but I would just tell you that you can make a strong argument for Saturday night. But regardless, you can't get 3 nights and 3 days with a Friday crucifixion. The Good Friday issue just doesn't work. So 31 AD is the year that you actually have a Wednesday Passover, and that would be Wednesday night, Thursday day, Thursday night, Friday, Friday night, Saturday, and at the close of Shabbat on Saturday, you have the resurrection. Okay, which again would put it on to the from the Hebraic perspective onto the next day, because their day starts when the sun goes down. The first 3 stars comes out. So notice that we have Peter and Paul and John listed here. We have Jesus listed as 30 AD. We have dates for Peter and for Paul as 67 AD. What's not on here is James, the martyr of Jerusalem. He was the brother of Jesus. We have a fairly certain date of 62 AD for that. It fell into a time frame in which there was turmoil within Jerusalem. There was turmoil within the Roman Empire, and anytime the ability of the Romans to project their power gets impacted, we tend to see peoples who are under the thumb popping up and trying to do something about it. So we have Ignatius and Clement. Clement we talked about. Clement dies in 100 AD. Ignatius dies in 107 AD. We have Polycarp, who goes out to 155. We have Justin Martyr, all the way out to 165. We have Irenaeus, who goes out to 200. And these are some of the big apostolic fathers. These are people who notice that Polycarp is the last of these fathers, apostolic fathers, who actually had contact with a true apostle. Okay? So oftentimes we include Justin Martyr, we include Irenaeus, we include others, but they actually are later in the timeline and didn't actually have contact with the apostles. All right, well, let's look at this in a slightly different way. Okay, this is a pretty busy slide. I've taken part of this slide from the internet, and that part on the left-hand side of your screen that the color is solid is what I've kind of added things to, because I wanted everybody to kind of get a sense as to the timing on these things. My first comment to you is that these dots that are associated first under the timeline, you see these Roman emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, Decius, Gallius, Valerian, Diocletian, and then I had to add, because there's so many of them, because things were really in turmoil in that first century AD. We have, during the time frame that Christ is crucified, Tiberius is the emperor of Rome. After him comes Caligula. After him comes Claudius. There are a couple of minor ones in here that I didn't include because it would just have gotten too busy. But the big ones are listed there: Claudius, Nero, Vespasius, Titus, Domitian, and then we have the ones that they have listed. Okay. I also added to this an idea as to what the Christian persecution looked like in that first century. Okay, notice that unlike that blue area of tolerance, and I will just tell you that there are strong arguments to be made that tolerance truly wasn't there in that time frame in the late 250s to 300 AD. There was still a bunch of stuff, as you'll see, that was going on. But in the early part of this, we had a lot of persecution of Christians. Okay, part of that didn't come from Rome. Part of it did. Part of it came from the Jews, right? The non-believing Jews, right? They were trying to stamp out this sect, right? And as was famously said and recorded in the Bible, maybe you better sit back and watch and see whether or not this God is in this or not, because if you are going against that which God is making come to pass, it's going to go really poorly for you. Anybody remember who basically, that was a paraphrase, but basically said that? He was was accused of being the hidden apostle. He was part of the Sanhedrin. He is Nicodemus. Yep. Yep. And of course the charge from the others in the Sanhedrin, what, are you one of these Galileans too now? To which he didn't say anything, but of course he was there as soon as Christ was killed to make sure that he could help to bring him down and to get him into the grave. So I also put onto this the persecution of the Jews, because this becomes really important as well. We have two really intense periods, 66 to 73 AD. Anybody know what happens in 70 AD? Fall of the Jerusalem, the sacking of Jerusalem, right? And they literally burn the temple. Yep, and the gold in the temple runs in between the cracks and drops down to places they can't get it, so they literally dismantle the temple to get at the gold that was there. That rebellion, one of I think this is the third of 4 Jewish wars that Josephus talks about, the others being prior to this time period, prior to the time of Christ. This rebellion will be put down. Remember, in this rebellion, Vespasian comes to Jerusalem and he gives a letter to those that are the Pharisees to allow them to come out of Jerusalem under safe passage and to set up a new school of rabbinic thought to maintain the religion of Judaism according to them, which is the rabbinic way of understanding things, the Pharisaical way of understanding things. And they do that at Jamnia, right? They're given a letter specifically to allow them to set that up and to be sanctioned by the Roman government. Now, Vespasian goes to the Roman Senate after destroying and killing off the majority of the people within Rome, goes to the Senate and says, I'd really like to embrace these Christians, right? Because they stand against the Jews, and the Jews have been a problem, and they're going to continue to be a problem, and so we should embrace the Jews and let them, embrace the Jewish followers of Jesus and let them kind of duke it out with the Jews, and then we'll have a lot less problems with the Jews.
Do they actually call them Christians?
No. Nope, that derogatory term, which gets used as a moniker of non-derision anymore. It's a badge of honor to be a Christian now, but it was a derogatory term originally. That comes a bit later, and the Senate's response is, yeah, we ain't doing that. Yeah, they either have got to adhere to Roman theology, Roman religion, which they saw that as a way to keep everybody in check and to keep everybody on the dole to the Romans, all right, the sacrifice and the sacrificial meats then being distributed. So the Senate said, yeah, we ain't doing that. You're on your own with that. It's not going to happen. Now, he did try to implement that to some degree in and around Judea and Jerusalem and the Galilee. However, as we all know, there was great animosity between those that rejected Yeshua as Messiah and those that embraced Yeshua as Messiah, right? With most of the animosity coming from the former towards those that believed, right? Because they thought it was a rejection of what they saw in the Old Testament.
So how did the Sadducees fill into that? You have the Pharisees, the Sadducees were doing the writing. How did they integrate with that when they were writing exactly what was done?
Well, the Sadducees die, so they don't end up writing anything. They write stuff before, right? But they are killed off, and they cease to exist as a sect of the Jews. Now we tend to think of Judaism as this monolithic sort of thing, but in fact, and we'll talk about this in next class, because this becomes a really important piece of the puzzle here. Like the real question we're dancing around is, okay, who the heck do we believe? Who has this right? Right? And so there is, we look at our Jewish brothers and sisters in the rabbinic Judaism that they have today, and even that is splintered between various groups, right? You have your Orthodox, you have your conservatives, you have your secular Jews, your Reformed Jews, you have your secular, agnostic, atheistic Jews. Or you have a complete gambit of those that believe and try to keep Torah, to those who don't believe at all and don't want to keep Torah and don't want anybody else keeping Torah. Okay, which has been a problem throughout the last 200 years. But the real question we're dancing around here is, who do we believe? And I'm not going to give you a definitive answer for that, but I think it's really important that everybody come to a place to where you understand it was a super complex, muddied, watered pond, and you ain't getting a clean drink. Okay? And as long as you have that understanding going into it, then you can filter the mud out of the water to get the water that you need, right? And you'll know to do that because you'll know that it's not that these folks over here have got the pristine little drink of water that I just need to drink from their well, right? Everybody's water was muddied and that's just the way it is, including the Jews. All right, so we have this Jewish persecution. 66 AD is when the revolt begins against Rome by the Jews. And of course, it's put down and completed. The temple's destroyed in 70 AD, and it takes them another 3 years to subdue the outlying areas of Judea and to bring everything under rule. Right? That's 7 years. It's a long time to be at work in those things. We have, moving into that time frame, we still have Jewish persecution by the Romans, right? There was still a lot of factions. There was still a lot of people attempting to rise up. The Zealots didn't go away. They were still there. They were still causing trouble. You still had the Pharisees who were now trying to deal with both the Zealots and this new group who claimed that Yeshua was the Messiah, right? They didn't want a suffering servant Messiah. They wanted a conquering king Messiah. And they continue this process, and when we get down to 132 AD to 135 AD, that's the Bar Kokhba revolt, right? Bar Kokhba renamed to be this star Messiah, right? That's who they were looking for. They were looking for this conquering king. He was a general. Rabbi Akiva just endorsed him and said, this is it, I'm sure of it. This is the Messiah, right? And even the rabbinics, you can see it in the midrashes, they're pretty harsh in their treatment of Rabbi Akiva and his embracing of Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. Right? Well, you have circumstances where they have literally pushed Rome out of Judea, and everybody and their dog knows that the Romans are coming back. And they're coming back with a vengeance, because this is war number 4. Okay? Over like 150, 200 years. 4 times they've had to come into Judea. And they're going to have a a solution to the Jewish question, right? Purposely putting that in terms of the Nazis. They are going to have a diaspora where they are going to literally take the people of the land. One, they're going to kill a vast majority of them. And two, whoever's left over, they're going to either sell into slavery and or send off to all parts of the kingdom. And the goal there is to not have anybody have sufficient numbers of people in order to maintain a community. That was their solution to the Jewish question. And by that way, the Jews would just kind of fade off into eternity and cease to be as a people. That was the goal that the Romans had. Right? You seed them all the way across and make it so that they do not have sufficient numbers to reproduce, and yet the Jews survive this, right, to this day. Not without some genetic complications, right? We have some genetic conditions that they test for specifically that come out of this because there's so much inbreeding back and forth within lines. But that's their answer. Bar Kokhba was not the Messiah, and with Rome pushed out of Judea, now the Jews were saying, okay, now we got to consolidate. Everybody grab your weapon, it's time to fight for the homeland. And we have to rally around Bar Kokhba, who is the Messiah. To which our Jewish brothers and sisters who believed said, what? No, he's not the Messiah. Yeshua is the Messiah. We can't participate in this. And we're not going to participate in this. He is not the Messiah. And for us to help you with this means that we are signing on to him being the Messiah, because you say that he's the Messiah. We will not do it. Right? And this divide, they had already just been under the hammer from the Jews, and this just created that much more of a hatred between the two groups. And as always, right, he who gets dumped on, it turns around and returns the favor at a later time. That's just a fact of life for humans. And the persecution that the Jews did on the believing Jews and on the Gentiles who believed will be returned in spades over and over again throughout the next 1,500 to 1,800 years. It's going to be terrible. There's going to be time after time after time when they are stepping forward and doing to them exactly what had been done to them, or worse. And worse is more frequent than not. But they will just absolutely return in suit exactly how they were treated. And that's just the way it is. Question?
Yeah. How do we know when?
Yep. So everybody can hear you.
Wait.
You have such a lovely voice. It's in the seat. Yep. There you go.
That's why you got grandchildren. How do we know when the Jewish people dispersed out of Jerusalem to all parts of the world? Because we have we have Russian Jews, we have
Yep.
Italian Jews.
Yep.
Why did they leave?
Because they were forced to leave by the Romans. So it wasn't that they were given the option. You can stay here, or you can go to these other places where we're going to try to make sure you disappear as a people. By Roman edict, they were forcefully removed out of the city and transported against their will to other places. Yeah, and then set into those communities in small numbers, with the goal of getting rid of them. That was it. That was the goal. All right. So that is the Jewish side of things. We have, and what we're going to read through real quickly, this is from the National Catholic Register, Kevin DiCamio. It's his blog from April 16th, 2021. And I thought it was useful. He kind of gives a very sugar-coated overview of who was doing the persecutions, right? The persecutions were horrible, the things that people did during these times: crucifixions, ravaging by animals, wild animals, being killed in the gladiatory field, I'm not sure how to say that, being lit on fire as torches, human torches, live human torches, to light the garden for a party. I mean, it's just that some of the macabre things that were done are just, they stretch our ability to understand them, just as the Holocaust stretches our ability to understand how people could do the things that they've done to each other. But the things that were done were just absolutely horrendous. And he at least goes through and lists over this time frame the 11 worst of, excuse me, of the Roman emperors. The first of which is Nero. And Nero rules from 37 to 68 AD, right? So the revolt in Judea is occurring. He is going to send Vespasian over to deal with that as the general, and he does, right? He's not emperor initially, but by the time he's in the process of this, 66 AD to 73 AD, he becomes emperor while he's over there. So he writes that the first, worst, and best known of the psychopathic Caesars, it didn't hurt his successors that he had committed such atrocities as it made them easier to reinstitute or simply to continue the carnage. His story and legend is so well known that there's no need to repeat it here, save that he began a blanket persecution of Christians. However, as socialists like to find nice things to say about mass murdering maniacs like Stalin, such as he industrialized the Soviet Union, it has been attributed to Trajan that Nero's rule excelled all other emperors. While it is true that Nero's reign began well enough, he did get a lot of building done. He also commenced the full-blown slaughters of believers in Christ and carried out atrocities that even our jaded postmodern sensibilities cringe at. All right, so that puts us into this category over here. We'll use a little laser. So Nero, right? We're right in that time frame of the Jewish revolt. He dies, and we get Vespasian, another emperor whose legacy included not only the persecution of Christians, but the demolition of the beloved Temple of Jerusalem in 70 AD. His decade-long rule saw Rome plant boots, or at least footprints, in both Bavaria and Britain. Vespasian was unique in that he had been a senator and a soldier, so perhaps it's no surprise that he was Machiavellian before there was a term for it. He saw the formation of his dynasty, whose main legacy was the lunatic Domitian. Domitian is going to come a bit later, closer to 100 AD, but in his line. All right, so this is Vespasian here. We have Domitian. And before we talk about Domitian, let me just note that the persecutions, notice, are still intense. There are minor respites in and amongst these as local rule relents a little bit, but the edicts from Rome are such that the Christians are being rounded up. They're being hunted down quite often. For Domitian, who rules between 81 and 96 AD, those are his ruling dates, not his death and birth. Almost every major writer of the time, from Pliny to Suetonius, claimed that Domitian, who wound up ruling longer than almost any other Roman ruler in that period, was a tyrant. St. John the Apostle and the Evangelist would agree. He was immersed in a tub of boiling oil in AD 95 at the explicit command of this emperor. However, as we are told by butlers, the oil acted only as a refreshing bath. Domitian had St. John, the beloved disciple, exiled to the Isle of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelations under inspiration. All right, our next one is going to be Trajan. So now we're kind of entering into this timeline. Remember that Clement dies right around 100 AD, right? So now the Apostle John is dead, and now we're reaching into a time frame where if we remember, we've moved from those who have directly known apostles to those who have known somebody who knew the apostles. Okay. Trajan, ruled from 98 to 117 AD. According to the ancient writer Pliny, Trajan was at best a monarch, at least an autocrat, and at worst a tyrant. Even-handed in dealing with the Roman Senate during his lifetime, no small feat, as the emperors had at best a stressed relationship with that once august body. Senators officially denied him upon his, the senators officially deified him upon his death, hence the famous Trajan's column in Rome, which stands to this day. For all the publicity as being one of the good Caesars, he continued the persecutions of the Christians unabated, and for good measure expanded the Roman Empire more than any other ruler since Caesar Augustus by military conquest. He also was a fan of bloody displays of horror of the gladiatorial games. Moving on to Hadrian. Like Trajan, he was of Spanish descent, and perhaps Trajan's cousin, and famous for his wall in northern Britain. Hadrian kept, does anybody know why the wall was built? It was to keep the marauding Brits in the north from coming down and pillaging and plunging the areas of Roman control, because their control was very scant. There's a whole bunch of really interesting archaeological sites that are currently working on forts that date to that time frame, and looking at how the influx of Roman ways of doing things, baths and currency and ways of changing British culture to a place to where it is amalgam, and yet outside of this wall you have those that are pagans that are just staunchly against that, and that they literally built the wall to keep them out. Hadrian kept Trajan's policy on Christians in place. There was no active house-to-house hunting out of them, but those who flouted the norms of the Roman polytheistic belief system were persecuted. A poet warrior, he took the fight to Britain, hence the wall, Africa, and ordered another brutal bulldozing of the Palestinian Jews. Remember, 117 to 138 includes that time frame of the Bar Kokhba revolt, right? When they did the last fortress starts with a B, and I apologize, I don't remember the name of it. I'll probably butcher it if I try to say it without. It's south of Jerusalem and down the hills, moving towards the plains that are going to take then the creeks out to the Mediterranean. And the killing there was the last place that the Romans did so, and they slaughtered pretty much everything that moved in the city, and that the blood ran into the creeks and out into the Mediterranean and was visible 2 miles out into the Mediterranean. Right? Normally we don't see that confluence of salt and fresh water, but because of the amount of blood in it. Those bodies were not allowed to be buried or cared for multiple years. They will get a release from another emperor to allow them to do so, and miraculously it said that the bodies hadn't really decayed in that time frame. But the carnage there was just horrendous. Let's see. So moving on, we have Marcus Aurelius. He is made famous in his time for being the Stoic philosopher, warrior, and in our time by Richard Harris's portrayal of him in the 2000 movie Gladiator. Unquestionably, Christian persecution increased during his reign, though some historians are quick to point out that this can't be directly traced back to the emperor himself. It's good to remember that Christian persecution during this era was not quite as centralized as we think it to be. It was sporadic and based more on various states and provinces rather than Rome itself, notes one professor of history. Regardless, Marcus Aurelius, for all his many military conquests, philosophical brilliance, and centralization of Rome, did nothing to prevent the persecution of Christians, and perhaps much to foster it. Remember that the Roman hierarchy considered the Greek imported polytheistic panoply of gods to be necessary for maintaining public order. Okay, so if you were disagreeing with their hierarchy of gods and the system that they had in place, you were inherently thumbing a nose at Rome and seeking to foster unrest, right? So they would come down on them pretty hard. The next one that we are going to have is not listed here, but he is Maximus the Thracian. He rules from 235 to 238. With Maximus Thrace, we are on surer grounds of Christian killings on the part of a centralized Roman state. Remember, that more centralized part of it is coming out of Marcus Aurelius, because he really had a very firm hand on Rome, particularly in the person of the emperor. An authority no other than Eusebius states in his watershed history on the early church that in the persecution of 235, Maximus sent St. Hippolytus and Pope St. Pontian into exile, where they were reconciled and died on the Isle of Sardinia. I don't know. Sounds like it beats being in the gladiatorial theater of the day. Reconciliation doesn't sound all that bad. The next one is Decius, and that was with each other because they were at odds with each other. One of the two of the later Roman emperors, the other was Diocletian, who we'll also talk about, who put their boots on the throat of Christian believers. In 250, Decius decided that all Christians had to pay homage to the Roman gods or be killed, and he was as good as his evil words. This carnage became known as the Decian persecution, as it came directly from the emperor himself. This persecution took the life of no less than a personage than Pope St. Fabian. Persecution went so far as to prohibit Christian worship within the empire, period. Mercifully, Decius died 1 year after his edict had been in effect. We have Valerian. Valerian ruled from 253 to 260. He was a man whose reign and reign of terror got out of hand. Like Decius before him, he continued the killing of Christians, including such great saints as Lawrence the Deacon, Denis of Paris, Cyprian, and Pope Sixtus II. However, he was continuously at war with the Persians, who wound up capturing the emperor, who died in their captivity, which sent shockwaves throughout the empire and was a harbinger that the empire itself was beginning to show signs of dry rot. Yep. And then we have Diocletian, 284 to 305. Even worse than Decius, Diocletian brought about the great persecution, which took the killing of Christians to all areas of the far-flung Roman Empire. In one refreshing change of pace, Diocletian, who created so many early martyr saints by his sheer bloodlust, actually retired from office towards the end of his life. However, the damage was done, and his pogrom against Christians was one of the all-time worsts. All right, and then to finish it up for the top 11, you have Constantine and Galerius, and they're in the early 4th century, so the early 300s. These count as one selection, as the former ruled the west and the latter the east. Now remember, there was a split into the Eastern and Western Roman empires, right? So you had simultaneously both of these guys reigning. Both continued a reign of terror, which included at the very least the destruction of Christian churches, as well as the destruction of Christians themselves. However, Christian history has been kinder to Constantine since. He was married to St. Helena, who founded the true cross in the Holy Land, and B, was the father of Constantine the Great, whose Edict of Milan in 313 established tolerance of Christianity, and according to legend, he was baptized by St. Eusebius of Nicomedia. His father, however, was not, as some have maintained, a closet Christian. And worse, Galerius made up for Constantinus's diffidence on Christianity with all-out, full-born persecutions. So my point in all this is that one of the luxuries that people will have coming up starting in the 300s is that ability to sit down without risk of loss of life in a significant capacity and to truly hash out the differences and to begin to really think about these things. Before and through this time frame, we have pockets of Christians, and they have their own various belief systems that they have. Some of them agree, some of them disagree, but there is a wide variety of ways in which they understood who Christ was, who God was, whether Christ was man, whether he was God, whether he truly died or whether he didn't. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which they are at odds with each other on major issues, okay? And so we can't just look at this time frame and say, oh, well, if we just throw a dart and pick one of these church fathers and proceed to take their word on it, again, we have to take everything that everybody says and filter it through the Bible and filter it through what agrees with Scripture and what doesn't agree with Scripture. And the reality is that what we have coming and what we have coming out of this time frame slowly is a consensus of some sort as to what it truly meant, as to who Christ was, what he was about. Right? And other questions will get turned to at a later date, but those very important questions early on as to whether or not he truly was a man or whether he truly lived, right? Those are just absolutely crucial to the question of who he was and what he came to do, and whether there is good news or whether there's absolutely no news at all, right? So we will... I'm going to take a couple more minutes and just finish up a couple of slides. We talked about this before, and we said that as we look at this group of churches that come out of Jerusalem, remember that the 12 apostles are charged, and that's the 12 not with Judas Iscariot, but 12 with Matthias, who is placed into that role as the 12th apostle. They are charged to start in Jerusalem and to spread the good news, first in Jerusalem, then in Samaria, and then to all the world. And they do that, right? And so we have the church in Jerusalem. We have the church at the churches that come out of the church at Rome. We have several branches that come out of Antioch. That branch that says Constantinople, the Byzantine churches are the Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and others. We have on the far side of this, coming out of Antioch, the West Syrian and the East Syrian churches, some of which disappear. We have Alexandria with the Coptics and with the Ethiopics. And of course, from Thomas, we also have a church in India as well. So they are doing this process, and as they are going through and they are spreading the word, anybody who has ever played the game of telephone line where you turn to your neighbor and you tell them something and they turn to their neighbor and tell them something will know very clearly that goes very poorly. Does anybody know what system that NASA uses to convey information to their astronauts? It's that system. You'd think that they'd be smarter than that. No, yeah, I'm sorry, but yes. Yeah, been there, done that. I can just tell you from experience. And it's just remarkable to listen. So we were, this was STS 77. I had a friend who was a primary investigator. She had an experiment that was flying on the shuttle. It was to search out and to determine whether or not you could take the concept that you see in a badminton shuttlecock, where you've got this wedge shape and a heavy end. You hit the end, and the end always flips around to be in the direction of flight. And then the cone part of that damps out the motion so that it flies straight. Well, their idea was to use a weighted cylinder and magnets in the cylinder itself to use the magnetic field to damp out the oscillations that you would naturally get. And it was done on a higher, faster, quicker. It used to be that if you were going to fly something on the shuttle, you had to basically order in excess of 100 to 200 of these parts and send them all through the process of destruction to find out where they failed under simulated launch loads, and then statistically you would know how likely you are to have something that actually survives the launch loads. Well, under this new program that NASA had, which was cheaper, faster, they were allowed to buy two. And so they tested one in the dynamic shaker, and that one survived, and then they went into lock trying to figure out, do we put the one that we know absolutely nothing about, or do we put the one that actually survived the shaker, the dynamic shaker? And they ended up putting the one that survived the shaker. It survived the first time, didn't survive launch loads. And so we ended up, and it was a bandpass filter that we were using laser light, so we were going to filter the laser light. The only thing we were supposed to see was the laser light, and we had a pinhole camera, and the problem was that once the lens shattered, you had not one image, but you had thousands of images, and they were all at a very, very low level so that you couldn't quite tell which one was it. Although the pilot, I will tell you, and that's a different story, was able to do so. So as we're trying to figure out what the problem is with our experiment, and everybody gets a slice of time on the shuttle, and when your time comes up, you got to be ready. We would sit there and say, okay, convey this message. And our leader would say, okay, absolutely under no circumstances are they to cycle the computer on the shuttle that's going to reset, because that will chew up 12 minutes of time while it restarts and recalibrates and resets everything up. The problem is not that. Do not cycle the computer. The person, that goes to the person who is head of our section of the Remote Payloads Operation Command Center in Goddard, who says, well, they don't think it's a very good idea to cycle the computer. And we can hear this, but we can't intervene. Nobody can hear what we're saying except for the person directly in front of us. And so from there, it goes to the head of the Remote Payloads Operation Command Center in Greenbelt, and he says, well, they say, don't cycle the computer. And then it goes to the Kennedy Space Flight Center, and it goes through 2 iterations before it goes to the flight director, who literally told, and again, we're hearing all of this, you can cycle the computer if you want to. Because nobody wants to tell the astronauts what they can and can't do, is really what it comes down to. So yeah, true story, unfortunately, that's the system that NASA was using in the 90s. I have no idea if they're still using it. Pray to God that they are not. On 77? Oh, very cool. What did he work on?
He was one of the people that did all the cleaning and made sure that the instruments were cleaned and everything, but that was in California.
Yeah, before it came over. Yeah.
Before it went to anybody else.
I think in that Remote Payloads Command Center, we had, I think, probably upwards of 40 different groups that were running experiments, and some of them were materials, and I was. They didn't know that I had been down at Oak Ridge and had done work in plasma physics, and was actually brought on to do the image analysis, because it was similar to the work I'd done in Oak Ridge. They just thought that I was a second-year veterinary student. And they were not at all happy that I was in the POC with them, but it ended up working out pretty well. Yeah, well, because people work their whole careers to get there, right? And who's this kid from? Well, I wasn't a kid, but who's this guy from Purdue who's a veterinary student? Why is he here? I had an aerospace engineering degree and a whole bunch of other stuff I'd done, but they weren't quite seeing that. All right, so we have all of these different groups, right? And all of these are going to claim that they are the true church, right? And they all disagree with each other. And we have, at least eight to nine of them here. We went through this chart. I'm not going to go through it again, where, again, the primary questions in those first 2 centuries is who is Christ? What does it mean? Was he God? Was he not God? How do we understand them? The Greek Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Church has got some very specific language that they use, but it's a modern understanding of the word in Greek for essence and the word in Greek for hypostasis. I changed the slide slightly to make it more clear. Their understanding of these things, the essence of something describes the state of being that it is, that it shares with all its other kind. So you can think of trees that are maple trees, and all the maple trees will have specific characteristics that allows us to look at them and say that's a maple tree, okay? And then you have the hypostasis of those maple trees, which separates each one individually, right? There are no two maple trees that are identical, even though they're all maple trees, even though we can all look at them and see by the branching patterns that they're all maple trees, right? But they're not, and there's not one of them that's identical, just like for us, there's not one of us who's identical, okay? We're all people, but we all have our various differences. And that's the modern understanding of it. The ancient Greek understanding of this actually flips those two to some great degree, because the hypostasis, that which is below the state, was understood as the fundamental reality of that group that supports all others, right? That would be what the modern folks call the essence, right? And then the modern people say, well, that's the individual peoples inside. But they would say that the hypostasis was the opposite. So that's a point of confusion. So we had those as a forerunner of next week's class, and we'll pick up here next week. We have all of these points of views, right? And everybody in all of these churches, in all of the ways of understanding things, all have a different point of view as to how they are seeing things. And the difficulty that we have is that all of these people are people who are people. There's no less image of God in any one of them than there is in us. And they may be wrong-headed, as we may be wrong-headed at times, but they're wrong-headed because they, for the most part, most of them are seeking to seek after God. And so again, we have to approach these subjects with a lot of grace for each other, recognizing that until Christ comes back, there's not going to be one way, there will be many, many ways. All right. As of July of 2022, there were 45,000, in excess of 45,000 different denominations of Christianity. When Christ comes back, there will be but one, right? He won't agree with one of us. I can almost guarantee that all of the 45,000 plus have something that's not right about them. We will be conformed to his image. He will not be conformed to ours. Okay, and so the goal is to again, with grace and politeness and kindness, approach these questions, but to look at them with some understanding as well. All right, we will pick up there next week, and we're actually going to take a rabbit hole down to look at Judaism and to look at the origins of what we consider modern Judaism and some of the scholastic work that's being done that I will just tell you that pretty much when we're talking about scholastic work, it's almost always approached from the standpoint of atheistic. And so one of their primary goals oftentimes is to throw out the baby with the bathwater in the process of what they're doing. But we'll look at the details of that next week. All right, as always, we are seeking to understand God's revelation to the world, given through the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. We see this as one God, one plan, one calling, to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, that we would be equipped to walk in the works that God prepared for us before God laid the foundations of the earth. If you have questions, you can reach out to me at midrashu.cms@gmail.com. And shalom. There was a lot in that, for sure. I'm going to shut the live stream down.